how can we use the framework of Alexander technique as a lens to look at nonverbal communication and social cueing, particularly when it comes to interacting with people, some of whom can read intuitively nonverbal communication and social cueing, and some who can't. This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today what we're talking about is this interesting intersection of Alexander Technique movement awareness and use of the self as a skill set, right? Developing your ability to address the use of yourself. And how can we use that in social contexts in particular? So, part of my interest in this comes from the fact that my only sibling, my older brother, is on the autism spectrum. So, my only age peer at home, we're only a year and a half apart, cannot read social cueing intuitively at all. And it can be very difficult for those two groups to interact in a way that doesn't leave at least one of them really frustrated and angry and feeling unheard and unseen. I find that I am a better communicator for my family, friends, and students who are on the autism spectrum, or also sometimes this can come up with folks who have hefty anxiety, ADHD, lots of different things can come up that can impact your ability to see, intuit, analyze, and then act on nonverbal cueing and body language. There are some pros and cons, honestly, on both sides, where for me, as a person who can intuitively read nonverbal cueing and body language, I can do something like walk into a room of 20 people and I glance around for a second and I know the mood, I know the vibe, and for many people they'll describe it as I can just feel it. And that sentence on its own can be quite confusing to someone on the autism spectrum because you're not actually feeling anything. Is that feeling like you're touching something? You're not touching these people. Is it feeling like an emotion? Well, they haven't expressed their emotions. They haven't said anything. You literally just walked in. So even to be able to have the conversation about how do I notice these things? How can I read these cues? First, we need to have even a way to talk about it and a willingness to get curious and examine our own biases on how do we communicate about communication. For many people who do intuitively read social cueing, it's something that we learn as kids. If you're ever in a situation where you're around little kids, like toddler or preschool age, they tend to just say things, and it's wild. Some of the things that come out of their mouths is really very funny at times and tends to be very genuine. There's not a whole lot of kind of tiptoeing around other people's potential responses. That's something that in a lot of people, I think it is still majority of people, that will change as we age. And as we get more towards like mid to late elementary school into middle school, we start to develop those kind of self-checks. And they become intuitive. They're not something that we do deliberately or like manually. I'm using figurative language there to talk about manually. It refers to the hands, I know, but it's like a process or a program in your head that you have to deliberately run in order to find out what's at the end of it. I don't have to do that. But I'm aware of what it's like for people that do because I've spent a lot of time around them. So what I would encourage people to consider is Alexander technique can actually be a really helpful way to bridge that gap. For someone who is not on the autism spectrum, it is an incredibly useful skill set to start to deliberately analyze what you're seeing. Make it a little bit less intuitive for a bit. What do you actually notice? This can be helpful not just in communication with people for whom it is unintuitive, but it can also help for eliminating biases and our own unconscious biases in when I see someone moving or organizing themselves in a particular way or giving me a particular facial expression with their facial muscles. What are some possibilities that maybe I haven't considered for why this person is doing what they're doing? What is it that I'm actually seeing? One helpful way to look at that is using the technology that we have available now, phones, cameras, right? Everything that is available in our pockets. Go through an actual piece of acting. Someone who's like a really good actor can show different facial expressions, and you can pause that and kind of analyze how are they moving their face, how are they moving their shoulders, their spines, and actually kind of mentally draw out what would that look like if I were to try to mimic that. Visual artists can also find this especially helpful if they're trying to draw visually expressive and emotive characters. What is it that you are showing in the actual lines that you're drawing that gives a sense of emotion to a character, or a sense of emotion in a direct conversation? And another interesting exercise you can do with this is if there are two people who both want to work on this with each other, you can stand face to face with each other and practice different facial expressions or different feelings, like say if you are feeling anxious or if you're feeling that your stomach hurts, show me that, right? It's almost kind of acting practice. And then the other person will describe what it is that they see, not in a intuitive reading the body language sense, but in a purely factual sense. I notice that you pull your shoulders forward. I notice that you round your back in a forward curl. I notice that you pull the back of your skull back and down. I had my students in my group class experiment with something kind of similar to this. I had them each hold a small object like a water bottle and stand kind of, two arms reach away from each other and then trade objects while noticing the use of themselves. And they can say hello, make eye contact, talk to the other person, and then give feedback both for how it felt in themselves, what they were working with, what their directions were, how were they cueing themselves, as well as feedback for the other person. What did you see? What did this other person actually do? And what did it make you think about how they felt or what they were thinking? I think that communicating across different neurotypes, when we talk about someone who is like neurotypical versus neurospicy is my favorite word for it. Lots of different flavors of neurospicy, not just autism spectrum. When we're talking across groups that communicate socially in different ways, one of the best ways that I find to navigate that is by doing the internal work of asking, why is it that I'm assuming something about this other person? I might be right. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to constantly check myself and say, no, I'm just making assumptions and that must be wrong. Just make it a little bit more conscious. What is it that you're seeing? For a teacher, for example, who is working with a student who is on the autism spectrum, once they tell me, generally, by the time they're here, this is a university, these are college age, both undergrad and graduate, they've generally got their diagnoses by the time they get here. I certainly don't diagnose anyone. That's not my job in the slightest. But if they come in and tell me, hi, here's the things that I'm working with. Also, I am on the autism spectrum, or also I have ADHD, or I have anxiety, or various different things. The most important thing that I can do is not jump to conclusions before asking a question. Many people who are on the autism spectrum really do great with direct verbal communication. That's something that I grew up with because it was literally the only way to communicate with my only sibling. So I kind of grew up in this kind of in-between neurotypical versus autism spectrum communication styles, because I was kind of in both interactions on a regular basis. Obviously, because I am not on the autism spectrum, I do tend more towards the intuitive reading of cues side, but I'm very comfortable asking direct questions. Hey, I'm noticing that you've curled your shoulders forward. Are you feeling cold or anxious? What are you feeling? And then they'll tend to say, oh, well, here's what I'm actually feeling. Oh yeah, it's just, I'm just tired and my back is tired and I just wanted to curl forward for a little bit because it felt nice. Okay, cool, great. And then you can just move on from there, right? Not everything has to be a huge deal as far as like, how do you handle having asked a direct question about people? For folks who might be watching who are on the autism spectrum, it's a lot of work to manually run social cueing. What I hear from friends and family and students who are on the autism spectrum is that it's just so tiring to constantly have to run all those things on purpose in their heads and to have to constantly analyze what they're thinking, what other people are likely thinking based on their movements when that isn't information that just arrives in their heads. It is also tiring to have to deliberately, I've heard people describe it as puppeting the meat face, right? How do I manipulate all of these different muscles in order to form the facial expression that accurately fits with social expectations for how I should be using these muscles? Because that's what it is. That's what body language in the face and nonverbal communication is. These are socially learned muscle uses. That's the core of it. And that's where I think Alexander technique can be so helpful. It makes the use of those systems a little bit more conscious for everyone across the board. And I think that that helps in order to communicate on both sides of that spectrum. It's not an aisle with like a deliberate gap down the middle of it. Autism spectrum disorder is called that because it is a big spectrum. So what I would encourage everyone to think about is, how can you use the use of yourself in social contexts? Whether you read social cues and body language communication intuitively or not. How can we all work towards a little bit more empathy and better communication with each other? Humans are social creatures. Very few of us actually want to really close people off and be completely alone. But it can be very hard to have a good, healthy communication connection with folks who think and intuit and organize themselves differently than you're thinking they should. So I would encourage everyone to give some thought and encourage empathy and kindness and awareness in our use of ourselves in interaction with others.